This conference will now be recorded.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 10th episode of the Hooved Animal Humane Society's Saturday Seminar Series. Today's topic is winter barn preparation. Our guest speaker, Bill Fulton, and I were just chatting about the frost advisories that we both received in different parts of the state overnight. But as long as we have a little bit of hopefully nice weather for a while, we are going to talk about ways to prepare your farm and your barn for the upcoming winter season, just to make everything hopefully a little easier to work with. So our speaker today is Bill Fulton, who grew up on a grain and livestock farm near Salem, Illinois, and has served on the Salem Fire Department for over 26 years. He is the district fire marshal while also actively farming and serving his community on the Cooperative Extension Council, the County Farm Bureau, and the County Soil and Water Conservation District. His farm includes a herd of over 90 Suffolk ewes, and he serves on multiple Sheep Industry Association boards. His lifelong experience in farming and raising sheep drove his desire to help develop the University of Illinois Fire Service Institute classes on large animal rescue, grain bin rescue, and other agricultural rescue programs. Bill has been on the IFSI field staff since 2004 and has taught over 200 classes on a variety of topics. Welcome to the HAHS Seminar Series, Bill.
Well, thank you. Appreciate the opportunity.
So I'm going to make you a presenter now.
Okay. Right. Set up here. All right. Again, thank you, Jen, for inviting us to be a part of this program. We really appreciate it. What I'm going to touch on today is just making things safer around the barn in the winter months and things that we need to do, including fire safety and just some other things. So we're going to touch on a number of different topics. Again, like Jen said, I am Bill Fulton, the District Fire Marshal at Salem Fire Protection District. Been with them about 26 years. Been with the Fire Service Institute about 17 years, mainly working in the ag rescue programming. I am a livestock producer. I don't have horses, but my son and daughter-in-law are very involved in quarter horses and in some of the warm blood horses. My daughter-in-law used to participate in some of the competitions, jumping competitions and that kind of thing. But I do have sheep and have had those. I've been in the sheep business for about 38 years. I am a board member of a number of different livestock organizations. I'm actually the chairman of the Illinois Sheep and Wool Marketing Board, and also a district director for the Illinois Lamb and Wool Producers. So have some involvement with livestock almost every day. And just to begin the program, one of the things I feel is very important, and this is the same thing we do all the time in the fire service, is we do pre-planning. When we have something, a large industry out there, or even some of our residential areas, we'll pre-plan, what could happen here? What could we do here? What's going to happen? And in this case, we would be looking at, what happens when the weather changes and that kind of thing. So, what we try to do is we try to foresee most of the issues that may come up during the winter months, in taking care of our horses, livestock in general. And then we can budget for most of those issues. We may not foresee everything, and I totally understand that, especially coming from the fire service side of things, but we try to cover as many as we can because we don't like surprises. None of us like any kind of surprise to come up. It's not a good thing when that happens. The main thing too, that with pre-planning, it evens out our workload. If we can get most of our forage into the barn and some of the other maintenance things taken care of with the barn, then we don't have to be doing that when it's 20 degrees outside at a chill factor of maybe -10. This is my life in the winter time, especially from about the last week of December through about the first week of March. I make multiple trips to the barn during lambing season. And I snapped this picture either last year or year before, and this is just one of my trips around midnight or 3 a.m. And again, this is kind of, I try to keep the barn prepped and ready to go and make it so it's easy to get out there, because it just makes everything work so much better when you don't have to deal with deep snows and that kind of thing. Fire prevention side. You know, we need to be proactive with our fire prevention. You know, it includes not smoking around the barn, that we just have a rule where we don't smoke around the barn at all. It's just not a good thing. It can always cause problems. We want to make sure that we keep the barn clean. And those kind of areas neat and tidy kind of thing. Don't leave anything out there for that. We want to restrict parking some of the vehicles in the barn, and I realize that a lot of times we're limited. A few years ago, before I built my second barn, I was limited as to where I could park my tractors and equipment, so they did have to go in the center of the barn along with the livestock. I had an area cleaned out just to park the tractors, but if at all possible, if we can keep those in a separate building, so much the better, because they, you know, they do cause issues. They can cause issues, I should say, where it might ignite, you know, hay dust and that kind of thing. And we just want to keep them as far away as possible. This time of year, go ahead and get that grass and weeds if there's any. And I know it's been a challenge this year. I think I've sprayed around my barns 3 or 4 times, and I still have some issues out there. But get those cleaned up and so forth, so we don't have all that dry material sitting right up against the edge of the barn, or a possibility of a grass fire that could get to one of the structures. One thing that some people don't realize and don't think about, but I, as a fire investigator, I have come across at least 3 times in my career, is rags that have some kind of a natural oil on them, like linseed oil and that kind of thing, will actually spontaneously combust. And so we need to keep those in airtight containers, whether it be, you know, just simply putting them in a garbage can and putting a lid over the top, or a metal garbage can is actually the best. But, you know, if you're not going to dispose of those and have them taken away by the garbage man, at least put them in some kind of container where they can't readily get air, because it can cause problems. The natural oils like linseed and some of those, and you'll see that on the container, there'll actually be a warning on the container, can cause the rags to spontaneously combust and cause a fire. And be sure when we're buying forages that they are dry. If they're not completely dry, you know, and I know some of the alfalfa producers and so forth try to get them baled as soon as possible to maintain those leaves on the alfalfa, but just monitor that forage and make sure that we don't have any issues where the bacteria is built up and started to heat that up and gets it up to the temperature where it can spontaneously combust also. As far as fire prevention, the things that we have to look at maintenance. We try to reduce the fuel sources around the barn. In other words, and we'll cover that in just a little bit, as far as like if we're having to store some fuels and that kind of thing, or just keeping things neat and tidy and not having any like paper towels or feed sacks and that kind of thing just laying around, because they can become a fuel source and then can set the barn on fire. The other thing too is make sure your fire department can find you. A lot of the barns, at least down here in my area in Southern Illinois, people have horses at another location other than where they live. And so it doesn't necessarily even have a 911 address. So they need to you need to make sure that the fire department knows where your barn is located, that that your 911 operator can give them specific information there as if you would happen to have a problem. And then the other thing too is learn how to use a fire extinguisher. And I'll show you here in just a couple of slides kind of what we were talking about there, but talk to your local fire department, fire district. I'm sure that someone there deals with fire prevention and possibly does classes and can do those for you. When we're looking at fire suppression, just kind of a warning, we never want to fight a fire that's rapidly spreading. This is where you really need to call 911 and get the fire department out there. That's our job. That's what we train for. We train on a regular basis to handle those, and it can be dangerous for someone who is not doesn't deal with it on a regular basis. We never want to fight a fire if it could spread, where it's going to cover our exit. And one of the things that we teach in fire when we're using fire extinguishers is always make sure that we've got an exit to our back. Make sure that we don't get so tunnel vision that we actually get away from the exit and then possibly we're not as efficient as we should be with that fire extinguisher and the fire builds and actually cuts off our exit. And never fight a fire if you haven't been trained to use a fire extinguisher. And I know they seem pretty simple, but in that moment when you're actually trying to save your property and so forth, things can happen where if you're not trained on them, well, one of the main things that I found over the years is I get to a situation, an incident, and they said, well, the fire extinguisher wouldn't work. I couldn't get it to work. And I look at it and there's actually a pin that has to be pulled so that the valves work and will release the product to put the fire out. And they didn't know to pull the pin. And obviously the fire extinguisher didn't work for them. When we look at fire extinguisher training, again, like I say, check with your local fire department or your fire district. For the most part, those folks typically have a program where they will train you on how to properly use a fire extinguisher. And it doesn't take a whole lot of time. Usually a class on fire extinguisher training is less than an hour, probably 45 minutes. Because what we're dealing with, we're teaching you to use the HAHS system. This was developed by the National Fire Protection Association in cooperation with the manufacturers of fire extinguishers. And the HAHS system is pretty simple. It's pull that pin so that it will actually activate the fire extinguisher, aim the nozzle, squeeze the handles together so that it opens that valve to release the product that will extinguish the fire. And then we sweep the base of the fire. We don't put it into the flames. We actually sweep it across the base of the flames where the fuel is actually at. And we're trying to put a layer of material between the fuel and the flames themselves and cut off the oxygen, there's a whole lot of different things involved with the way a fire extinguisher extinguishes a fire, but we have to get it on the base of the fire for it to work properly. In case of a barn fire, some of the things that you need to look at, keep a halter and lead rope near the stalls where it's easily accessible. You're probably, if you would experience a fire in your barn, you don't have time to go to the tack room and hunt up the halters and all that kind of thing. Have them readily available, have them where first responders can find them and get those halters on those horses and get them out. Have evacuation plan for your barn, just like you should have for your home, as far as where you're going to take the horses, how they're going to be, where you're going to pin them outside, because we do want to pin them outside. We don't want to just take them outside and turn them loose, because it's been our experience in the past that, the safest place that horse knows is that stall. And even if the barn's on fire, they will try to get back into their stall as opposed to just staying outside the barn. And then if we develop that evacuation plan, we need to practice it. Have an emergency contact number posted on the barn, especially if your barn is not located at your residence. This way, if some passerby actually sees a problem, the law enforcement or the 911 system can get a hold of you directly and get you started that away, because you're going to be a big resource for the first responders showing up, whether it be fire department or law enforcement or whatever, as to whatever that problem may be. You're going to have more influence on those animals than anybody else that shows up. So it's good to have those contact numbers and make sure you keep them up to date. As far as hoses in the wintertime, we want to make sure we keep them drained so they could be used in case you did experience a small fire. Sometimes we forget, but every time we use a hose, if we're not keeping it in a area where it's climate control, we need to make sure we drain it so that it's empty, and that way we can easily use it probably to contain a small fire. If you're building a facility, we need to space those barns out to reduce exposure. I know it's really nice to have barns close together where we don't have to put up much fence to move animals from one place to another and that kind of thing. But we also, that causes an exposure. Then when we have one building on fire, then possibly radiant heat sets the other building on fire. So in a little bit of pre-planning and farmstead work there, we can kind of control some of that issue. Smoke detectors are a good thing. If you've got a barn where you actually have like a security system and so forth, it's not a bad thing to have smoke detectors and so forth hooked in, so that they call the fire department as soon as there's an issue or it seems to be an issue. And trust me, we don't, as long as they're working properly and they so forth, we don't mind alarms at all. We will be more than happy to come out and check them out and make sure that there's not an issue. The other thing that works really well is camera systems. Camera systems where you can even check them on your cell phone are just super. That way you can, you may be 30 minutes away and you can pull it up and see, is there an issue or what's going on here? As far as proper fuel storage in your barns, always use a UL approved storage container, whether it be a diesel fuel container, which should be yellow, or a gasoline container, which would be red, or a kerosene container, which would be blue. Make sure that they are UL. You can buy cheaper ones, I'm sure, but when they're tested by the underwriter's laboratory, they should be able to contain fumes and so forth and be much, much less of a problem. The other thing too, when we're storing fuel, we want to store it away from any kind of an ignition source. And I'll show you, I've got a picture of a cabinet coming up here that's a fuel storage cabinet. And some entities do require a fuel storage cabinet on your property. Use proper fuel storage, and like I say, fuel storage cabinets, and this is what they look like. This is a UL approved fuel storage cabinet. Obviously, this is one is open where you can see what's inside, but those doors close and it keeps everything, it's insulated to keep things from being ignited and so forth, and it also contains the vapors. The next thing we probably need to do with that barn, and this is a good time of the year to do it, is review your electrical systems. We don't want to see anything like this in the barn. We don't want to overload those systems. It's always good to upgrade the system if you can. If it's, I know a lot of places that are running on 1 or 2 or 3 circuits. If at all possible, do an upgrade where you've got plenty of circuits to handle whatever load you put in the barn. Obviously, we're going to be using more lights in the winter time, so make sure that we've looked at all of our light fixtures. I know from time to time, birds, some other pests can cause problems with lights in the summer, through the summer. Make sure those are all in good working order, no cracks or breaks and that kind of thing. Make sure we've got proper grounding so that we're not, none of the animals can receive an electrical shock, or the owner themselves cannot receive an electrical shock. And, check out your the electrical systems for your heating equipment and your de-icers for like your water tanks and that kind of thing, and make sure those cords are in good shape. And if they need to be replaced, go ahead and replace those, because I know when the storm hits and the temperatures drop, seems like we start seeing a lot of the de-icers and so forth going off the shelf, and then all of a sudden you need one and it's not available. Extension cords. Use at least I prefer a 12 gauge cord, and it will tell you right on the label when you're purchasing it what the gauge of the wire is. A 14 can work if you're not going too far with it. The main thing we want to stay away from is intermixing cords like this one right here. These have no place in the barn. These are just a fire hazard to begin with. When we're starting to do, there's nothing in the barn that should be running off of a small cord like we would have maybe in the living room to run a lamp or something like that. The other thing that you can do is make sure that your circuit breakers are properly labeled so that you know where everything is going, and you know, if you do have a breaker that consistently trips or something, you know what it is feeding, and we can take care of that problem also. It also allows, you know, the fire department to shut down those particular circuits. If you would have a small issue, we can isolate those and still leave the rest of the power onto the building. As far as lighting, when we're looking at lighting in the wintertime, you know, we want to prepare to work in the dark by making the lights working more proper, making sure they're working properly, making sure that we've got enough bulbs and that kind of thing. Always have a spare flashlight available that's dedicated to the barn in a certain area. Usually what I like to do is put it right by where my light switches are for my barn, so that, you know, if something's gone wrong, or let's say we have an ice storm and we're actually out of power, you've got a flashlight right there that you can utilize, and you don't have to worry about trip hazards and that kind of thing making your way through the barn. The other thing we can do is we can arrange our feeding times to the daylight hours if possible. And I realize, you know, if you're working off the farm or working at a job, that may not always be possible, but if we can, maybe adjust feeding times to where it's after the sun comes up and before the sun goes down. As far as heating equipment, we look at all these different issues of forced air heaters, radiant heaters, again, the water heating or de-icing equipment, and then we also could have issues when we have heating equipment with carbon monoxide. Forced air heaters, make sure that those are in proper working order. You know, test them out now before we really actually need them. We never leave a forced air heater running unattended. They are basically an open flame type heating system, so we don't want to just leave them running in the barn. Always make sure that the barn is well ventilated when we're using these type heaters, and always remember, let them cool off before we refuel. With radiant heaters, again, what we're wanting to do is we want to check that they work properly and safely. Make sure that you have a circuit that you're plugging them into is heavy enough to handle that heater. Keep the heater away from any of the combustibles. Now, most of the UL approved units do have a switch that if they would tip over will shut them down. But I will tell you, again, from experience in the fire investigation side, we have seen issues where they tipped over, but they leaned over against it. Something that was combustible, the switch was not tripped, and it set that combustible on fire. So make sure that we keep at least like a 3-foot, 4-foot area around those heaters so that there's no way that they can set any combustibles on fire. Again, also, there's different qualities of heaters out there, and we want to make sure that those are UL approved units. When we make that purchase, they're going to probably be a few dollars more, but they're very much safer than units that may save you a few dollars down the road, but they're not UL approved. And never leave these heaters unattended either. I know Sometimes, especially if you've got like a well house or something like that, they do set some of these heaters up where they are unattended, but of course you've got them in a contained area and they're going to be isolated where it wouldn't be a problem. But if you're using them just in an open barn, we just don't want to leave those on and unattended because they can be tipped and cause an issue. As far as water heating and de-icing equipment, make sure that these, again, are properly grounded. We want to shield the cord from chewing. Some of the units do come, as you can see down here in the lower left-hand corner of the screen. This has got a kind of a cover over that cord so that the chewing won't necessarily affect it. But make sure that we keep it where the animals can't chew it, the horses can't get to it. Make sure the devices are, again, in good working order. If there's any question for the cost of what some of these units cost, just replace them, because this can happen. This was a picture that was sent to me about 2 years ago where they were using a couple of the heated buckets, and apparently there was a crack in the cord or an issue with that, and there's actually supposed to be 2 buckets sitting there, but as you can see, one caught fire and melted away and actually started setting the stall wall on fire. As far as protecting the cord, one of the things I do here, even on my farm around the sheep, is if I've got a cord running out to a water tank outside the barn wall, I will actually get a piece of PVC pipe and just run the cord through that. It keeps them from chewing directly on the cord. The main thing there is just remember to purchase a piece of PVC pipe where the inside diameter is large enough to allow that plug to slip through it. But this is very effective as far as protecting that cord from any issues with the livestock or the horses. Another option that would be out there is thermal cubes. They come on at somewhere around 35 degrees Fahrenheit, and then they turn back off at 45 degrees Fahrenheit. So in other words, you're not running the unit all the time. There is an energy savings to it. But the other thing I think is just as important is it lets that equipment rest. It doesn't have it constantly running and heating. It lets that, when the temperature rises, it shuts it off and lets that rest, and you're not utilizing that piece of equipment when it's above 45 degrees. Now, when we get to carbon monoxide issues, it's a product of incomplete combustion. It is an odorless, colorless, tasteless gas. If you're using a heater in your barn, maybe you've got the farrier's going to come or something and you're wanting to make it a little more comfortable in there, and you're using that heater and the fumes just seem to be burning your eyes, and when you walk in the barn, and you really need to vent that, because you're getting incomplete combustion. You're not picking up the carbon monoxide. You're picking up other products of combustion, but we know that is incomplete combustion, and we need to get it vented out successfully. These can make you sick. They can make your animals sick, your horses sick. We just need to make sure we're well vented when we're using any of these forced air heaters and so forth, where we could have carbon monoxide issues. As far as carbon monoxide, what it does to you, if you look up in the upper right-hand corner there, you can see the gentleman's arms are bright red. It displaces the oxygen in the bloodstream and can cause death. And one of the symptoms is that bright red coloring in the skin. The lower right-hand side here, there's a carbon monoxide detector, an example of one. Not a bad thing to use in a barn. It can just give you a heads up if there is an issue out there. When we look at weather issues in the winter time around the barn, ice on surfaces, ice on the ponds, heavy snows coming in, power outages possibly caused by ice storms, and then it could be that we need to trailer our animals somewhere, and so we have to look at how we can trailer them successfully in the winter. As far as ice on surfaces, be cautious when we turn animals out to a slick paddock. you know, maybe we've had them up for a week or 10 days and they didn't get a whole lot of exercise, and boy, they're really excited to get out there. If you look in the lower right hand corner here, this is a call that we actually had in my fire district, where they turned a horse out and it went out on some icy, hard, frozen ground and slipped and fell and got into some mud. It was probably the coldest day that winter, and got down, and then we had to help him get it back in the barn, which is, we were more than happy to do that. It's just that it just stresses the horse and puts them into some issues. That hard frozen ground can also lead to some other problems, you know, whether it be leg injuries, foot injuries, or even hip injuries. If we are dealing with ice on ponds, we want to limit access to that pond when they're iced over. We don't want the horses to walk out on those ponds and fall through. If you must water with the pond, then we want to use the shallowest end to do that watering, and we want to limit it to supervised access. So in other words, we'll cut a hole in the ice and we'll be there watching the animals while they're watering, and then get them away from that particular area so that they don't walk out on the pond. If you do have an ice emergency with your horses, call for help as soon as possible. The quicker we can get there, the quicker we can help the animal, and they won't get further out into more problems in the deeper water. As far as heavy snows, keep an ear to the weather forecasts. I can't emphasize that enough. You know what's coming at you, you know, not just overnight, not just 3 days ahead, but maybe even 7 or 10-day forecasts. The National Weather Service does a really good job now, I think, with forecasting, and it just does well to keep up on what's coming at you even further out. Make proper plans to have your feed and water, you know, 3 or 4 days supply for sure, maybe more. Watch out for excessive snow buildup on the barns. You can see down here in the lower right-hand corner, this barn collapsed due to heavy snow on the roof. Keep drives as clear as possible. You know, if nothing else, just for you, the caretaker. Makes it easier for you to get to the barn and do what you need to do to take care of those horses successfully. It could be that you're having to have something delivered, like forage or horse feed, that kind of thing. So it makes it better for those folks to be able to get up to the barn. You know, you may need to call a vet. And remember, his hospital is in his truck. And so the further they have to park away, the harder it makes it on the vet and the horse. It takes longer for him to treat the animal because he's got to walk back and forth. And lastly, make the access good for fire department in case you would have an issue, because most of the hoses on our pre-connected hoses on fire engines are somewhere around 150 feet, some 200. And if we're going to make an entry into the barn, then we've got to be fairly close so that we can drop that hose and still make it inside the barn where we may have the problem. As far as medications out at the barn, you know, move all your freezables into a climate controlled area, whether it be the house or maybe your tack room is climate controlled. That'd be great. Check the label, and just to make sure that you've covered everything, you know, on your any medications you may have out there, because freezing can damage some of them. It can cause the active ingredient to precipitate out, and so forth. Another thing that I like to do, and I actually do, is I develop what I call a vet kit that can be carried back and forth, and I keep it in the house. I don't have any climate controlled area in any of my barns. And I've got what I need when I go out there, but then it comes back in the house and into a warm area when I'm coming back and it's not in use. It looks much like this one right here. This is one of my lambing kits right here. As far as power outages, we see a lot of people using portable generators. We just want to make sure that they're properly vented. typically what I tell people as far as properly vented is I like to have it outside. I don't like to have it anywhere inside the barn and running. I would prefer to have it sitting just outside the barn, possibly under an awning or something like that. But I don't like to take a chance on any kind of a carbon monoxide buildup or fumes building up inside the barn, or a malfunction of the fueling system or anything like that. I like to have them completely outside the building. We only refuel these when they're cool, just like we would with the forced air heaters. Well, the other thing too is make sure when you're buying a generator that you're not overloading its capacity. Make sure that we buy one big enough to do everything that we would think we would need to do, during an extended period of power outage during like an ice storm. The other thing too is when we have a power outage, we have a tendency to go around and turn things on and then they don't work, so we don't remember to turn them back off. So let's make sure that we haven't turned anything on and left it on unattended, such as radiant heaters and that kind of thing. And then we put the generator, we start the generator up and possibly power those things and don't really even realize that they're on. So make sure that we've got everything turned off that we don't want on when we start using a generator. Now moving on to trailering in the winter. One of the first and foremost things I think is make sure you're road ready. Probably more than any time during the year when we are trailering, we need to make sure that we're ready to go in the winter time. Probably the next worst thing would be trailering in July or something when we've got extremely hot conditions. But wintertime, for both the horse owner and the horse, we need to make sure that equipment is road ready. We want to do a pre-trip weather check. And here again, if you're going to be gone over the weekend, not only do we want to check, what it's going to be on Friday night, but what is it going to be on Sunday evening when we're headed back, or Monday morning. And of course, it goes without saying, but drive with extra care when we're trailering. It's not going to operate the same as it would on a perfectly dry pavement, especially if we're dealing with ice or iced over areas where it snowed. Have a truck emergency kit, whether it be when I go any distance at all and I'm trailering, I have everything from a battery operated impact so I can quickly change tires and so forth, to an extra jack, extra gloves, extra blankets, that kind of thing. So we can handle about anything that we come across out there. And then check your hitch and then double check it and make sure that everything is sound and ready to go, because it probably is going to have more of a stress, I would think, in the winter time than any other time during the year. Make sure the headlights, turn signals, brake lights are all free of snow and ice buildup. And as you can see up here on the little photo I put in there, it's going to be hard to tell if that truck's turning or not, especially in the daylight hours, because of the coverage of snow on there. And that can happen very easily, I realize, but we still need to make sure we keep those clean. For horses, we want to make sure that we wrap all four legs with a shipping wrap or some kind of boot, because that is an extremity that could end up with some frostbite issues as we're trailering, if we're going any distance at all. And the other thing too is make sure all your vaccines are up to date, just in case you do get stuck somewhere for an extended period of time and maybe even have to board the horses somewhere. It is so much easier to find a boarding location and so forth if everything is up to date and ready to go. We need to think about stop and watering our horses about every 3 to 4 hours, because dehydration can lead to colic, as you folks well know in the horse business. But especially in the wintertime, we need to make sure we do that. Ventilation is necessary inside the trailer, so we have to kind of gauge that ventilation. We don't want to freeze them out, but we also want to make sure that they have plenty of air movement in that trailer, and we don't develop any kind of moisture issues and so forth inside the trailer. So we probably need to stop and periodically check vitals of the animals just to make sure that they're doing well, especially if we're going, if you're traveling 6 or 8 hours to some location. just make sure everybody's up to par back there in the trailer. And I know some people do have cameras in their trailers, which is just super. The other thing that you can add is temperature monitors in your trailer, where you can monitor those either from your cell phone or from the cab of the truck. The other thing too about trailering is make sure when we park that trailer, when we're done with it this fall, and we're not really going to use it again until later on in the winter, that we don't park it in an area where we can't get to it. You may end up with a situation where you need to trailer an animal because to the vet or something, possibly even in an emergency, they become hurt or something. And we don't want it, the one on the left, we don't want to have to dig it out. If we'd rather be able to back up to that trailer and hook onto it like the one on the right here. Powered equipment stored in the barn, again, I don't like to do that, but sometimes we have to. We want to restrict the engine running time in the barn as much as possible. We also want to make sure that the equipment is in good running order, that we don't have any issues with electrical systems or fueling systems or any kind of leaks. And if possible, you know, on the diesel equipment, a lot of times they have a block heater, but if we can rig those up with a circulating block heater as opposed to just a regular block heater, and that's what in the lower left corner here, that's a circulating block heater. What we can do with these, instead of having to plug them in and wait hours for that block heater to just sit there and warm up that particular area of the block, the circulating heater will actually circulate that hot water throughout the whole block on that engine. And these can be plugged in for 20, 30 minutes, and then the tractor's ready to start. And we don't have to leave them either constantly plugged in or have to wait for a couple hours to get that tractor started. As far as ventilation, there's no doubt in my mind that you all understand horses need ventilation in the barn. You know, any good horse owner understands that. But there are many ideas about how to accomplish this. One of the things that we need to look at is if we have poor ventilation in the barn, one of the things you're going to see is an accumulation of moisture on the inside of the barn windows. If you're starting to see that, then you probably need to look at opening some windows, opening the top door on some of the exterior stalls or something like that, if at all possible. We don't want to freeze them out or anything like that, but just get some ventilation going. Some things about ventilation in the wintertime, as far as horses are concerned, is we want to feed a low dust feed, whether we have it blended with like a soy oil or maybe even a liquid molasses, that kind of thing, to keep the dust down. We can feed hay in feeders that are low to the ground, where they're not flipping that hay around a lot. If you're set up to do it, steam forage works very well, if that's a possibility. The other thing too is on a nice day where you're sure that there's not going to be an issue with it, a major temperature change, is open the south doors and just let that barn air out, let that ventilation get rid of some of that interior moisture and so forth. The other thing we can do is we can use a more absorbent bedding in the wintertime. And there's a lot of resources as far as the difference. As you know, pelleted shavings work, or I should say pelleted wood products work better than shavings. Probably the least thing would be straw. If building a new barn, make sure that we include a coating on the interior of the roof so that we don't get that moisture accumulating up there and dripping off. I've got that kind of a coating on my new barn, and it's just fantastic. It's not, you don't walk in there at any given time and it acts like it's raining inside the barn. It keeps that down to just absolutely no moisture problems. The other thing too is a vent in the crown of the barn is also helpful for proper ventilation. As far as weather, of course, that's one of our main concerns. We want to watch forecasts, again, 3 to 4 days out, maybe even as long as 10 days out, and just keep an eye to that weather in case we're possibly running low on feed, running low on forages, so that we can get those restocked. The other thing we have concerns of is the temperatures and drastic changes, snowfall, ice storms, and mud. We want to keep that animal comfortable. You know, we want to have adequate water. We don't want them to have extreme cold. We want to make sure we keep the snow removed. We want to control mud as much as possible. We may want to schedule a vet visit, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. And we want to keep rodents down to a minimum. When we look at adequate water, I pulled some of this information off of a couple of the websites. You can go on and look up winter, just some of the things about winter, Google that and find some of the same information. 1,000-pound horse takes about 6 to 10 gallons of water per head per day. Ideally, the temperature would be somewhere around 45 to 65 degrees. Without that adequate water, you can run into some problems with impaction colic. So we want to make sure we keep them well watered. If a horse is forced to drink extremely cold water, it's going to use more of their calories. And so we want to make sure that water's warm enough when we give it to them to drink. And even worse than that, if you're dealing with some senior horses, they may have sensitive teeth and they just may completely limit their intake because it just literally hurts when they try to drink if you're using cold water. People sometimes think that, well, I'm going to turn them out and they're going to be able to get a hold of some snow and that's going to be good enough. Well, it's not. It takes 6 to 10 times more snow to provide adequate water than just giving them some good fresh water. The other thing too, if you've got automatic waters, you need to make sure that there's no stray voltage. Signs that can give you an indication that the automatic water may have some stray voltage problems is the horse starts to drink and then jumps back quickly. You may end up with the breaker that's supplying that automatic water starts tripping on a regular basis. If that's the case, you need to get a licensed electrician out there and have them check it. And one of the ways that you or the licensed electrician can check it is just take a voltmeter and just, put the positive probe in the water area and then ground the other probe. And just if you get voltage, then you've got some stray voltage in that system and it needs to be corrected. As far as cold, typically we don't really think of cold weather bothering horses, but if we include drafts in the barn, we get into some high wind conditions or some heavy moisture conditions, then it can cause problems with them. One of the things that we can do is keep a little thicker hair coat on those animals as long as it's clean. That will help them through the winter. If a horse has paddock and they're out there during a snowfall, then we want to make sure we get all that snow off of them before we stall them. That just adds to the moisture. I run into that problem all the time with my ewes coming in because they've got that good thick wool coating and it just literally does not melt the snow off of that wool, and we run into moisture issues with them. A thin layer of fat will also help insulate those horses from the cold. We don't want to make them, of course, over fat, but we do like to see a little thin coating of fat, and this is something that we can start right now in our feeding program. And folks, I'm not a nutritionalist, I'm a firefighter, but that's one of the things that we can do to help them through the winter is get them in condition right now. And we can look at that by doing body scoring. If you're not familiar with body scoring is a rating from 1 to 9, with 1 being extremely thin to 9 being extremely fat. Again, you can go and Google this information, just horse body scoring, and come up with charts just like I've got right here on the bottom of this page. And we want to have a score of 5 or higher starting into the winter. That's going to help them make it through if we get into some extremely cold conditions. Again, I'm not a nutritionist, but there are some things that we looked at as far as feeding in the winter. Remember that for every degree below 18 degrees Fahrenheit, it takes more energy in that ration. We can add energy by adding corn and oats, of course, but sometimes there's a better way of doing it. Actually, the fermentation of fiber will increase more heat than the starch and grains. So, you know, we may end up increasing the amount of forage that we give them. You know, typically we look at about 1% of their body weight per head per day for forage. It may end up in extremely cold weather that we're feeding, if they can consume it, 2% of their body weight per head per day. But the fermentation of that fiber will actually keep that horse warmer than anything that we could feed, like oats, corn, that kind of thing. As far as snow removal, when we start looking at the actual snow that's on the ground, we want to make sure that our snow removal equipment's ready to go. For tractors, you know, make sure that the cold weather starting equipment's ready to go, whether it be glow plugs, block heaters, that kind of thing. I usually start about November the 1st of putting additives in my diesel to keep it from gelling. And if you're familiar with diesel tractors at all, you understand that as the temperature drops, there's a tendency for that fuel to possibly gel up. When it gets extremely cold, or we get into extremely low wind chills. So we put in, you know, there's products that you can actually add to the fuel to keep that from happening. If it has a cab, it's always nice to make sure the cab heater works. That's for your comfort. Or if you're not using a cab and you've got the availability of a heat houser is kind of like down here in the lower right-hand corner. It just goes over and kind of funnels that engine heat back towards the operator. Those work well. We want to make sure that our batteries are good so that when we go out there, those batteries are good so that they can be used. They're going to start that tractor and not have any problems. I saw a question come up about an ABC extinguisher. There's no issue with those freezing. They're actually a dry powder. The only thing, Ruth, what we would do there is we would, from time to time, actually take it off of where it's, you know, they usually come with some kind of a hanger, and we just take them and we turn them upside down and kind of give them a little shake and that kind of thing, just to make sure that powder stays free and doesn't cake up in there. But yeah, there is no, ABC extinguishers are excellent in the wintertime. The last thing on tractors is antifreeze. Make sure we test it, and it's good for below negative 20 degrees. As far as snow removal, make sure the attachments that we're using, whether it be a blade or the loader or whatever, are in good working order, well ahead of it. If we have a forecast for heavy snow, it's a lot easier to go out there and hook up that equipment before the snow hits, as it is trying to do it while it's snowing. If you don't have that kind of equipment, now is the time to talk to a reputable snow removal contractor, because I will guarantee you, when a blizzard hits or a heavy snow hits, it's no time to start looking for the contractor, because he's already got a long list and you're going to be way down that list. The other thing too is just take a look at your barn doors and make sure that if you had a 6-inch snow, that they will still freely slide or swing open. Because again, it's a lot easier to fix that now than it is when we actually have that snow on the ground. Sometimes it's not snow, sometimes it's mud that we're dealing with at barn. You know, we want to look at our drainage now, because fall is an excellent time to work dirt and look at our drainage and get those drainage systems working properly, as opposed to when it becomes extremely wet and frozen and that kind of thing. We want to look at the placement of our gutters, and if they're, make sure that they're cleaned out already, and where the downspouts are funneling the water, because again, these can cause muddy messes out around the barn. Make sure we're getting rid of that water. And make an area maybe for muddy conditions. One thing that I have found, I've seen in a couple of horse barns in our area, is they do this kind of thing. They go out and they dig down about 12 inches and they put in about 6 inches of clean 1-inch rock. They cover it with about 4 inches of what they call road pack, which actually has some limestone mixed into it. And then they finish it off with a layer of either limestone or sand of about 2 inches thick. And this is just an area where they can exercise the animals during muddy times, and they don't, you know, these areas don't become muddy because of the drainage, internal drainage and so forth. And it just works out really well for them. The other thing to do probably right now, as far as prepping for winter conditions at the barn, is get the vet to come out and have a visit. It's extremely important that that horse is ready to go into winter. We do that visit, you know, probably somewhere right now into mid-October. And if there's an issue, it'll give you time for them to recover. Let's say we've got some parasites that we didn't think about, internal parasites, that kind of thing. We get them wormed and gaining some weight and possibly putting that thin layer of fat on. It's just going to be a good thing. It takes time to develop that, so we need to get that vet visit done here fairly quickly. And besides that, we've now established that veterinary clinic client-patient relationship. And if you're not aware, next June, a lot of the over-the-counter antibiotics and other drugs are going to disappear due to FDA regulations, and you'll have to have a veterinary client-patient relationship to purchase those. So it's not a bad time to get that started too. As far as rodent control, there's 2 ways to control rodents. We can either prevent them or we can eradicate them. When we're looking at prevention, this is where we keep feeds cleaned up and everything nice and neat and tidy. We use rodent-proof feed bins to store our feeds so that it's not really available to them and we don't get a buildup of rodents out in the barns. We want to close up any cracks that are wider than 1/4 inch around the barn, so that, and if we can't do it completely around the barn, at least where we're storing the feed or around the tack room where we've got the feed, so that they don't have readily available access to any of the feed steps. As far as eradication, we can use ultrasound rodent repellers. Those work very well. I use those in my barns. We can use traps that either are live or otherwise. You know, the main thing is we need to check those regularly, and we can use bait stations. If we're using baits to kill these animals and dispose, we want to make sure if we find any of these carcasses that we get them disposed of, because we don't want our pets or any small children to be handling them or pets possibly consuming them, because again, we could have, they could cause problems with some of the baits can actually transfer to the pets. And senior horses in the wintertime, there's a few things there. I know that they make some targeted feeds specifically for them. And this is something that I would probably target. I know with some of my older rams and so forth, I target them with some special feeds specifically for based on their age and so forth, to help them with cold and so forth. We want to look at gentle exercise for them around outside the barn, you know, remembering that we've got cold temperatures and we got frozen ground, so we don't want any foot or leg or hip injuries. It could be that this is the animal that really needs the blanket. We want to make sure that we've got good shelter for them, plenty of room. Most of the time we look at about a 12 by 12 area for a horse. We want to make sure it's got a good windbreak and no drafts, especially for the senior horse. Again, make sure we've got adequate ventilation, because I think they would probably be more prone to pneumonia and that kind of thing. And we want to make sure we keep that moisture down to a minimum. We want to make sure that we've got liquid water for them to drink, and especially with these animals, we want to make sure that that temperature is, you know, probably plus 60 degrees as far as I'm concerned, so that if they do have some issues that we're maybe not aware of with their teeth and so forth, they're going to go ahead and drink adequate water and not run into any kind of colic problem. Anytime we take them out, make sure we've got secure footing for them. And again, we want to get them dewormed well ahead of winter time. And again, I'm not a veterinarian. I work with a really good guy that's a veterinarian on our program at IFSI, but I have sheep and I know all about internal parasites. So we want to make sure we've got them well taken care of before we get into winter time. The other thing, you know, proper hoof care, get with your farrier, make sure that you've got that taken care of. And maybe in the wintertime, we may even go shoeless with them. That is up to the individual owner. I'm not, again, I'm not going to, that's up to your, however you deal with it. But shoes can cause a problem on frozen ground. And so, in summary, we've got a pre-plan. Things just work so much more smoothly if we pre-plan and we don't have any surprises. I'm not big on surprises. Always practice fire prevention. Again, no smoking around the barn. Limit the amount of time that we have any motorized equipment in there. Make sure that we supervise any of the heating equipment that we have in there. Make sure our electrical systems are ready to go, that kind of thing. Again, learn to use a fire extinguisher properly. You learn that pass system. If you can, get a hold of someone at your local fire district or fire department and have them go through fire extinguisher training with you. Most of the fire departments, their fire prevention bureau has a program where you can take a short class on fire extinguishers, and it does help. Again, review your electrical systems, make sure they're ready to go, make sure you've got enough, make sure you don't overload your circuits and that kind of thing. Store your fuels safely, even if you have to store them somewhere else rather than the barn. Make sure you use your heating equipment and your de-icer safely. If you need to cover those cords and so forth to limit any kind of chewing that might take place and so forth, we kind of gave you some ideas about that, maybe putting them in some PVC pipe, but that works very, very, very well. Again, monitor your carbon monoxide levels, even to the point of getting a carbon monoxide detector and putting it in your barn. And just consider all the possible winter issues, whether it be heavy snowfall, whether it be ice storms, extremely cold temperatures, high winds, that kind of thing, and even in a mild winter, mud. If you have to move horses or livestock in the winter, make sure that you follow all of the safe trailering practices that we kind of talked about. There's some other organizations out there that have some really, really good ideas on trailering practices, and I encourage you to look those up and just kind of go through them like a checklist. Again, like I say, there are many resources out there. You just look up winter barn safety, Google it, and read some of the articles from some of the really great publications that are out there. Probably covered some things in those that I haven't covered today. As far as the Illinois Fire Service, we offer first responders a number of classes through our Cornerstone program. One of those would be agricultural rescue techniques. This is where we were really talking about tractor rollovers and that kind of thing. And also there's a whole, that takes in everything in the agricultural rescue side of things. Then we we do a class called Fires on the Farm, where we talk about specifically how to handle some of the fires on the farm. We do a class on anhydrous ammonia emergencies. We do both a class on grain bin rescue awareness and operations. And we do a large animal rescue operations class and an awareness class. The operations class, the difference in the two there, one, awareness is just classroom, operations is actually hands-on with livestock. So are there any questions that might have come up? I know Ruth had the one question about the ABC extinguisher. I'd be more than happy to answer any questions. Or if there's no questions, I actually have, hang on here. Jen, did I just lose my screen? Here, I need to go back one thing here. Let's try this. If anything comes up, this is my contact information. There we go. Try this. There we go.
Wonderful.
This is my contact information, and I will tell you with the cell phone, leave a message, because in my new barn, it's like the cone of silence, and I do get voicemails, but the phone doesn't even ring out there. It for some reason blocks it. So, okay, that's what I've got for you today. I hope I gave you some helpful information about wintertime in the barn, but again, if you've got any questions, I can answer those, or you can get a hold of me at a later time.
Bill, thank you so much. Actually, I did write down a couple questions, and I know you said just jump in when you were talking about it, but I was so busy writing them down, I forgot to do that.
Okay, that's fine.
If we have to keep our equipment inside, if we don't have an equipment shed or another barn,
Right.
What can we do to minimize the risk?
Well, the main thing, you know, I mentioned that circulating block heater as opposed to the block. If you're familiar with a regular block heater, it's just like a heating element that just sits inside the block.
Right.
And a lot of people will leave those plugged in all the time because they don't want to have to wait on that tractor to warm up for, you know, an hour or two. The circulating heater will actually allow you to probably get that tractor started in 20-30 minutes, because it's circulating the water, and as opposed to just heating that was right there. That's one thing, but the main thing is just making sure that you've got the maintenance up on that tractor. You don't have, let's say, a fuel leak. You don't have any hydraulic leaks, any electrical problems. A lot of times we see people having an issue, for instance, with a battery, and they'll actually leave the battery charger on the tractor, charging the batteries. If the battery's that bad, probably just replace them, because there's an extreme issue there with a fire hazard. The other thing too is, I mean, once we start that tractor, just pull it outside and let it run outside. So I've seen some people who let them run inside. For one thing, you're putting a lot of that exhaust inside the barn, and that's not good for you or your animals. And you know, like I say, once you get it started, just get it outside, and if you're not going to use it right off, at least get it outside where you're not filling the barn full of exhaust.
Okay. Would you also recommend, you know, kind of making sure that wherever we have to park our equipment, it's raked or swept clean of hay,
Yeah.
shavings, that kind of thing. So, you know, if it's going to be a particularly cold snap, a couple of years ago we had minus 40 degrees up here. So I think even people who might not have normally put their equipment in the barn did for those couple days. And so just kind of making sure that there's no straw, there's no hay, there's no shavings, there's nothing nearby that we're parking on that could.
One thing that I got into a few years ago with a different tractor that I no longer own was my barn loft has gaps in the, has like a half-inch gap between each board on the floor,
Mm-hmm.
so the hay gets more air in the summertime. I mean, when you're first putting it in there.
Oh, great.
And when I would back the tractor in there, I had to be cautious because it had a low ceiling. So when it first fired off, this was an older gasoline powered tractor. When it first fired off, it actually threw sparks up, and I actually put a piece of metal, a metal ceiling over where that tractor was backed in so that it wouldn't throw the sparks into the hay that was right above it.
Oh, wow.
So
Okay.
that's one thing to think about it when you're parking them, is make sure you're not throwing anything, like if you've got a hayloft, if you're parking them under like a hayloft or something, that you're not throwing any kind of sparks or anything up into the hayloft when you start it up.
Right. We always think of down, but we
Yeah,
don't think about sparks going up. Oh my gosh.
right.
Okay. Thank you. When you mentioned the soiled rags, we clean our tack or we're just cleaning stuff in the barn. Would just like a 5-gallon bucket with a lid, would that work
Yes.
as well?
Yes. Anything that limits the oxygen, what you end up with spontaneous combustion, typically it's it's because it's getting adequate oxygen to ignite those rags. And so anything that you can do, I would prefer a metal container,
Okay.
like an ash bucket.
Like an
They make an ash bucket with a cover. It always has to have a cover. That's the main thing.
Okay. Great. And you mentioned when you were talking about extension cords, which, you know, is the bane of any horse person. There's never enough outlets in the barn.
Right.
Um, you mentioned some numbers. When we're looking at extension cords, for a heavier gauge that can support some of these higher draw items, are we looking for a higher number or a
No,
lower
you're
number?
wanting
I
a
know
lower number. You're wanting a
a
lower
lower
number. The lower the number, the larger the diameter of the wire. So, in other words, a 14 gauge wire is smaller than a 12 gauge wire. The 12 gauge wire is a heavier wire. It's a larger diameter wire. And unfortunately, like the little white cord that I showed you, a lot of times those are 18 gauge. So they're
Oh my
very
goodness.
small. Yeah, there's very small wire. They're made, like I say, for a floor lamp in a living room or something like that.
Okay, so anything that comes from anything that looks like we would use it in the house should not be in the barn.
Typically, no. Yeah, right.
Okay,
And like I
wonderful.
say, every or I shouldn't say every because that covers too much territory, but most often when you're purchasing an extension cord, it's going to tell you right on the label, it's a 14 gauge cord, or it's a 12 gauge cord, or it's a 10 gauge cord. So,
Excellent. Okay, and then I know we're always looking for tips for snow removal. So, being that you have a working farm, anything you can share with us in that regard?
um, as far as, are you talking about the equipment to do it, or the
Just
where you want
where you would put it,
to? Okay.
sort of, is it better
Well,
to do?
the thing I look at when I'm looking at snow removal is, number one, it's out of my way. I don't pile it. I don't just open up a driveway. I do try to get it completely out of the way. I look at putting it where when it melts, it's going to melt and run away from my driveway, from my barn. Again, trying to keep out of the mud and problems like that. Um, I Other than that, uh, and the other thing I always try to anticipate, you know, in January, is this the first snow and then I'm going to get another one? So I want to make sure I push it far enough away that if I have to pile more snow, I'm not now back up into my driveway and that kind of thing. I'm getting it far enough away that it's when it's got time to melt down and get rid of it, you know. And then the second snowstorm comes along and 3 days later, I can still push that snow further out and that kind of thing, if you understand where I'm going with that.
Absolutely. Yeah, you know, you think, okay, this is the last one of the season, and then surprise.
Yeah, yeah.
Wonderful. Okay, does anyone have any other questions for Bill? Okay, we do have every good podcast and webinar series does have that question that all of our guests are asked. So ours is, what was your favorite book growing up that inspired you either to go into the fire service or to go into farming? What was your favorite book as a child?
Well, I would have to say, well, it hasn't got anything to do with the fire service, right? Really, but probably as far as my favorite book was any of the series, All Creatures Great and Small.
Oh, wonderful.
I am a
James
huge
Harriet.
fan of James Harriet.
Okay.
Matter of fact, I've seen all the different series on PBS and so forth. Uh, that's honestly, at one point when I was in high school, I wanted to be a veterinarian. So
Wow. Okay, that's very interesting. We are very glad you went into the fire service and were able to provide us with all of this excellent information today. I spent the whole time just grabbing screenshots of your tips, and we'll share those out throughout the winter.
sure,
So everyone, we do have Bill's contact information up here, and we will put this information in the Facebook event, so you can always go back to it and refer back to it and find it quickly without going through the recorded video, which will be available on our website and our YouTube channel shortly. We also want to remind you that registration is open for our November episode, which will be caring for the senior horse. Bill, thank you so much for those tips about perhaps offering our senior horses a little more forage and also keeping in mind that teeth sensitivity. I hadn't even thought of that, but yeah, they need to drink, and if the water's too cold, just like when we get that little zing, um,
yep.
we don't want them avoiding their water bucket during the winter. So Dr. Lisa Nesson with Iron Gate Equine Clinic in Madison, Wisconsin will be with us November 12th to talk about caring for our senior horses. And then for our local friends, we do have a couple events coming up at HAHS tomorrow. Next weekend. The 16th, Sunday the 16th, is our monthly tack shop hours, as well as our farm tours. And then Halloween weekend, Friday, October 28th, we are doing a Dine to Donate event with the Crystal Lake Panda Express restaurant. So 20% of your order will come back to HAHS. So please do visit our website or our Facebook page for this flyer, and you just need to show it to them and we will get credit for it. So we look very forward to seeing everyone at Panda Express. And again, we'd like to thank Bill very much for being here today and helping us get ready for winter with our animals.
Well, thank you.
Thanks, Bill. And we will have you back at some point for another topic.
Okay, that'll be great.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We hope you enjoy the rest of your weekend.